Okay, so hello and welcome back to another episode of Grief Unedited. This is a place where we have real, honest, and sometimes quite raw conversations about grief and loss. I'm Karen, your host, and I'm an accredited counsellor specialising in grief and loss, and I've been working with individuals and couples for over 15 years now, helping them to make sense of their journey through loss. Now, for those of you who have been with us for a while now, you'll notice that we are now in season two, which is incredible. I can't get my head around the fact that we're already here. But this season we're shifting the focus slightly to welcome in professionals from across the field of death, dying, grief and loss. And if you've been listening to some of our earlier episodes, you'll see that we've got a whole variety of speakers talking about their industry expertise. So this today we're sitting down with Mandy Gosling, who I'm going to get to introduce herself in a little moment to tell you a bit about your background because it is quite vast and varied as well. But I always want to drop just a little, I suppose, health warning, content warning before we dive into the conversation today. And that's just to really listen with your own wisdom. So if today feels like a particularly griefy day for you, and what we're talking about feels in any way unhelpful, then it's absolutely okay to pause us, put us off, come back to us whenever you feel like the time is right for you. We know that sometimes grief can turn up unexpectedly, so I always say, just as I say, check in with how you are today and whether this is a useful conversation for you. If you'd like to support the podcast, if you've been around and listened to some of our other episodes, there's a few ways that you can do that this season. So, as always, we love a like, a share, and interaction because that helps spread the word out onto the platforms. So, if you found today's episode useful, then do by all means give us a share, a like, or an interaction. And this season, we also have a Buy Me a Coffee link, which is ultimately a way that you can support the podcast and the production of it. Again, if you've been around for a while, you'll know that this is an absolute passion project for me, but it does cost money for me to produce it. So if you can contribute, if there's anything you'd like to donate towards it, then that would be absolutely welcome. So, Mandy, delighted to have you on. I know you and I have talked a bit back and forth over the last few while just about getting together and doing this episode. And I've got to say, I personally am really excited about this because I've been following your work in a completely non-stalkerish way in the background for quite a while now because your work is something that's really close to home for me on a personal level. So I've been mindful that I've always just kind of been keeping up with the work that you're doing out there in your corner of the universe. So yeah, for people who haven't met you yet, tell us who you are and what you do.
This is always an anxious place to share your work. When you're a therapist, you usually listen to people and interject in a small amount. So to put yourself on the spot, in the spotlight.
Like, who are
Um,
you?
who am I? Uh, I I come to this work, I think, wearing three different hats. And I think the way those hats intersect helps me support people in a really helpful way.
Mm,
So, my lived experience, my mother died when I was 9 years old. It was 53 years last week, actually,
wow.
which was kind of an interesting experience, which I might come into later. Um, and so it really began at that point. And then to add to that, in terms of my lived grief experiences, my father decided when I was 18 to sell the family home and leave. So that was another grief experience, different. Um, and then I went to live with my grandmother, who died when I was 21. So it was fairly complicated.
Yeah.
And I guess being an only child, there was nobody else. So from that point on, I felt very alone in the world. I was physically alone, but also I think emotionally alone, really, probably from when my mother died. Fast forward, um, actually, no, I began. I think it's interesting to understand how these seeds can grow,
Mm,
from one's own lived experiences. I became really interested in kind of understanding humans in a way. So I started reading about it in my 20s. And then in my mid-20s, I had, got married, had my family. Um, and I think there was some level of understanding. I probably wasn't functioning as well as I could. There was, behaviors that were happening that probably to the outside world looked unusual, um, distasteful at times, I suspect.
Mm.
And then after my children were sort of getting a bit older and in my 40s, I thought, well, what am I going to do with my life? And I'd always been interested in relationships, behaviors. So I thought I would um, train as a psychotherapist. And so I committed to 5 years training as a psychotherapist, which for anyone who's a psychotherapist, it's brutal. Uh, it's not for the faint-hearted. But it was probably the best decision I ever made in my
Mm.
life because it helped me understand who I was and what I needed. And then beyond that, I did a 2 years master's, which was my first research in understanding what it meant to be parentally bereaved as a child and be an adult in that space, which was the first time I came to my grief. So that was in my late 40s. I hadn't even in my training, I'd had 4 years of therapy. I never talked about my mother once.
Wow, never once.
Never once. It was all
Wow.
around, the relationship with my father, which was fraught and difficult. Um, so yeah, I think that's kind of interesting to think about in terms of, where we see clients and in their grief response. And I'm always respectful in understanding people when they don't want to talk about grief. We think we want to poke around and sometimes it's not the right time,
Mm.
but we can still be supportive and help people understand when the time comes, how they might be ready to sort of step into that space. So, drawing upon my own experience and then learning as a psychotherapist and bringing those two pieces together, the lived experience and the therapy, and then the research, the first research really helped me understand. I did a heuristic inquiry, which was my own journey, and over 2 years, I delved into what was happening within me that would then bring data forward.
Mm.
It was quite phenomenal. And I used various methods through my training organization. One of them was dreams. My research is actually published on the Dream Research Institute in London.
Amazing.
Um, and it was wholly transformational, but it was then the foundation of my work. And then as I was researching, I realized that it was quite I think then it was a unique experience, or I felt it was a unique experience, and there wasn't perhaps so much, or I couldn't find so much about this experience that I had experienced and also now started to research. So I became a bit of an advocate for, speaking about it. And, I would knock on lots of doors and say, well, what about this? And,
Mm.
what about adults bereaved as children? Um, and I think what I've noticed in the kind of last 10 years since the research, there's more come forward for it. And I think it has become a topic of interest and research. And then 3 years ago, I met a professor through the European Grief Conference, and I asked him to do some research. And we spoke for about a year, and I kind of gave him some information, and I did some kind of sort of small sort of data collection. And then he said to me, "You have to come and do it in the Netherlands. It's yours. It's you. You're the expert." So that was I broke down in tears and couldn't quite believe that this was happening. And it had an enormous effect on me because after my mother died, my education was really compromised. And I think
Mhm.
I've come to everything so much later, which quite often, people bereaved in early life do because they can't focus on their education.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that's kind of where I am now in the journey. And I don't know where it's going to lead. It's led to some interesting places. I'm part of the all-party parliamentary group on the impact of, grief and death in society. I'm actually speaking next month to MPs, which is, a real privilege to do so. So I keep trying to find places to speak about, what this experience is and perhaps what we can do to support people in this space, because it's, in my eyes, a fairly unique type of grief.
Mm.
So that's kind of how I've got here, really, and speaking to you, and it's nice to know that you didn't stalk me.
I think though, like the world of grief and loss is something that I think people are often quite surprised to learn that in terms of the research and what we know in a real like peer-reviewed empirical sense, it's actually quite small compared to what we know about lots of other things when it comes to human behaviour and our understanding of how people navigate life. So I think it's such an exciting time, I guess, to be involved in the research because there's so much of it that really is, quite groundbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, I think once you start entering into the research space, like properly,
Mm,
you start to see how much is there. I think where I feel the benefit of my research is by wearing these three hats. Um, it it makes me think broader and it makes me think
mm,
deeper
mm,
about the experience. And of course, it all has to be underpinned with theories and previous research. And then you can constellate your own ideas. Given, I mean, for the last 16 years, I've been in a research project. I mean, that's the very nature. My clients have taught me so much beyond my own lived experience. And I think that's really important to name, that when you have only lived experience, for example, you are only a expert in your own experience
yes.
because there is much more beyond that given various factors. And so, when I began, I guess I did make the assumption, if I'm being really honest, people felt like me in my
Mm,
lived experience, which then as I began to work with people and, they taught me about their lived experience, which was unique. And I literally sit with people and it's like people think grief is just grief. And it's not. It's so much more complex than that. And it is unique as the individual.
mm,
And I think we have to pay credit to that in terms of only having lived experience knowledge. But then you have psychotherapy knowledge as you sit with people and they teach you. I mean, you must find that, Karen. People teach you all of the time when you work in this
they do.
space.
Yeah.
And it is a constant research product. It makes you think more. It makes you go to your books. It makes you go to research papers, to understand. And for the most part, it's been discovered previously.
Mm,
You know, is research brand new? No. We
no.
stand on the shoulders of other people. But then when it becomes your own research, is how you bring all that together, how you use the different types of research that is already there to then encapsulate something perhaps small, extra, the gap, to add to that knowledge, and expand that and move that beyond, the point it is at now. And that's the importance of research,
Yeah.
and also I think psychotherapy,
Mm,
where you can bring the two together. And I feel very privileged, to sit with people and listen to their experiences that, I take the knowledge from them, understand it in a clinical or theoretical lens, and then that helps me support other people. So it's just a really magical experience.
mm. One of the questions I've asked all of my guests, which I love hearing what people's kind of response to it is. So I want to kind of put this to you, Mandy, and see what lands for you, but what's been one unexpected lesson for you in terms of your professional experience that you just wish more people knew or understood or had a sense of?
Um, I think it's something I've said in my workshops many times is always expect the unexpected. So I don't think there's one unexpected lesson. I think there are many unexpected
It's
lessons.
all.
So to name one thing would be too narrow. So I'll give you a personal example. So last week, as I said, it was 53 years that my mum died. I've obviously done a lot of work, and scraping around inside myself in places that many times I had wished I hadn't, but then realized it was, very much needed. Um, but something unusual happened for me last week. I had a slight trauma flashback, which
Wow.
I hadn't expected, but using my own, phrase, expect the unexpected. And for whatever reason, I needed to sit with that and be with it, digest it, observe it, pay attention, give it space, and to not feel that that was wrong. It's
Mm,
a it's a common it's a common expression. Am I doing it wrong? Am I doing it right?
yeah, hear that often.
I started, I think it's the fifth group therapy with It's Time charity last night. And a common theme in the first session, I'm here because am I doing it right? Am I not doing it right? Um, and I think we doubt ourselves, and it's kind of what I said at the start is you have to go at where you are, your pace. Was there a reason why I didn't speak about my mother for 4 years in the beginning of my training? Yes, of course there was. And I don't need to beat myself up about that. So it's expect the unexpected, but also be with where you are and don't force it. It will unfold. And I think that's a respectful place that we feel for ourselves
Mm.
and also, for our clients.
I
Um,
often talk about that idea of like nothing to be fixed, because I think in so much of the psychotherapy, self-help type worlds, everything's about fixing and improving and doing better. And it's like, I think grief sits in quite a unique space in that we're not trying to
it
fix it, we're not
does.
trying to mend it, we're trying to figure out how
No,
to be alongside it.
it's, you know, it's kind of in that existential space that we live in, that life is uncertain. Well, grief is uncertain
Yeah.
too. We don't know how it's going to present itself. We don't know when it's going to present itself because we haven't lived the life, the uncertain life that we're going to live, and what will arise in those moments and how it might touch our grief. And I think that's important to understand. It's not something just, grief, going through the grieving process is not something that just happens at the time, when
Mm.
it happens, and particularly not when you're a child or adolescent. Often it 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 goes underground in a way,
Yeah.
and it might need to. So, and I think last week, I was still in my own process as a lived experience, going, wow, 53 years. Okay. Curious.
Mm.
I'm talking to my husband going, I'm feeling really strange today. And actually, what was interesting, and because it was, my mother died around Easter, and so Easter is always kind of my anniversary event. And of course, there's research around, uh, grief peaks, when
Mm.
anniversaries or special days, or Christmas, those type of, times when we're very aware that our person is not there, and particularly sort of like, death day. So mine's transformed over the years. but I still am drawn into the Easter time because it's an unusual thing that I learned several years ago. Not at the time. I mean, I couldn't have probably held it at the time, to be fair, and I don't even remember at the time. That I had bought my mother an Easter egg, and that happened to be placed upon her coffin, which is it's kind of an unusual fact to,
Mm.
discover. Um, so Easter will always be my event because I know that information now, and so there is a symbology attached to it, so it will cause that peak. And I think everybody will have those moments. It's a very common expression that I see. I mainly work with people, who've experienced early life loss. I mean, as a psychotherapist, I work with other presentations and other losses. But, as we're talking about this in terms of the work I do for grief, these anniversary events do happen. And, reading the research, and actually there was a recent research paper done on it, and a new one. But it's likening them to what I would say windows of opportunity into
Mm.
grief, as
Mhm.
opposed to, oh, I don't want to think about it or that. It's like, so I'm very aware at Easter when that happens, but I wasn't expecting that last week.
Mm.
And my sleep was off for even a couple of days before. So even what was happening inside of me unconsciously was stirring,
Yeah.
and I think sometimes you might feel off, but I would align that with my grief response, that
Mm.
something was stirring and it was going to come forward, and it's not instant and it's not fixed at the time and it's not all processed at the time. Particularly with young people where they might not have the cognitive capacity to do that. They might not have the environment to do that. They might not want to do that.
Mm. Mhm.
So there are lots of different reasons of why.
I think though as well there's something so helpful about your lived experience of like this is never done. There's never a full stop in the end of grief for you because I think like often within the kind of grief profession, people know that. We talk about it often, we recognise it as a really obvious thing, but when you're new to grief, when you've maybe never had these conversations before, when you've never had that experience, I think there is still a bit of a misconception out there in the world that we're done with grief at some point and that's it, filed, and often it's bookcase to sit for the rest of its days. So to hear that even after all of this time it's still so live for you in those moments
Yeah,
is
I mean,
quite
I think that's
powerful.
important to share,
Yeah.
because, expect the unexpected. Now, you might not have responses because, as everybody's experience is different. Um, and I think potentially, I'm going to stick my neck out a bit here. I think potentially some grief can be integrated and um, lived with without it really peaking
Yeah.
at those times.
Mhm.
Um, Having experienced, again, as you know, I've just experienced both my in-laws dying in
Mm.
January and February, and that was a very different experience for me. And I was very conscious in how I walked with it.
Mm.
And it also taught me the necessity to attend to grief that hasn't been attended to so that any future losses, can be navigated in a more healthy and adaptive way rather
Mm.
than maladaption. That was a big learning because I purposefully went into it in a very conscious way with my husband, with talking through before it happened. One of them was unwell, the other one, died 3 weeks after the first one. They were both really old, but it was a very interesting experience to walk with when all my losses had been kind of traumatic and no preparation. So doing it very consciously was actually a really beautiful experience, which I
Mhm.
had not experienced before.
Mm.
And it taught me what's possible with anticipatory grief, and
Mm,
and actually you can really, if you're courageous enough to step into it and be with a person and talk about it and have open conversations, it's a really beautiful experience.
mm,
And I'd never done, anybody's death in that way.
mm,
But it taught me another lesson. And then, I talked to my husband like, how do you feel? And he's 63 years old and his parents were kind of 90, and like, what's it like? And he said, actually, I feel really good. And I
wow.
think because we've done this anticipatory grief, but then also, there was sort of nothing left really unresolved, and he
Mm,
could feel what he needed to feel, and then it was integrated in a way that was more healthy, more
mm,
helpful. And I check in with him time to time, he said, no, he said, I feel really good. I'd had a really nice time with him. We got to do all the talking and that before. So it was a different experience, which was, and I think that's also important is, if we've had an early life loss, and it's something I advocate, if I see somebody who's had an early life loss, I may have seen them in that time, they may come back if for future losses, that we then change the pattern of dealing with grief, rather,
yes.
say from a maladaptive response, or more, I've got to survive this, to a more conscious grieving in their current loss.
Mm,
But that, like once a set state has happened in the way you do grief, and I think, me practicing it with my own lived experience and also my therapy and my research I had on, I could do something very, very different. And again, the importance of that.
So what you're saying there again, just to kind of break that down a little bit, is that when people have those early life losses, that template for grief and our experience of grief at that time isn't then necessarily how we will have to experience every other loss since
Yeah,
then. We have an opportunity to learn from that, perhaps to, as you say, come into it in a different way at a different age and stage of our life, where actually the
yeah.
experience of the loss can be different, can be,
It can
yeah,
be different, but having worked with people in this space, I think what it's taught me is there's a propensity to do it the same.
yeah, because that's what we know, isn't it? Do you know,
That's
it's like
what we
we,
know.
it's what we know.
But I guess I'm throwing into the pot the possibility of doing it differently, which
Yeah,
may have, you know, a better journey through it and with it.
yeah.
That there are ways in which you can do it differently than, say, when you were a child.
Mm. I'm also mindful, Mandy, of like how many people may have been in that position that your husband appears to sit in, where it's like, "Do you know what, I can make sense of this in a way that feels okay, I can feel good in myself," but society puts that but onto them of like, but maybe the grief's not resolved, but maybe it's coming to get you at another time, but maybe you've not grieved, like I think sometimes when people
Ah,
feel good in their grief, they have this worry of like, where is it? Like it's almost like waiting round a corner to
am
come
I
and
am I
surprise
doing it
them.
right? Well, it might be waiting around the corner, but it's not there right now. I think this is the whole, inner journey of, your own wisdom. Um, yeah, how many people get to do it like him? I don't know,
Hmm.
because they wouldn't usually end up, in my clinic. Um,
Not many people are living with a you in their world either that can, I guess, facilitate that.
no, 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 no. I made him do it. Because I understood, that it was important to do, and I think that's what, offering this podcast about what is possible,
Yeah.
beyond what we know, and what society tells us. I think is another of my phrases that I often use in therapy. Be careful what you listen to.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, be careful what we listen to, and that's right across, all domains I work in. Because you are the person to trust. Your own self is the person to trust, to develop a relationship with yourself, your feelings, and what needs attention.
Mm.
Nobody else can tell you that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
society may say, various things. You haven't done it, or aren't you over it yet? Or, the classics that we hear, well, one I often, one that I kind of really raise in the room for people who are bereaved early to hopefully, break some of the shame that they often arrive with
Mm.
is okay, yeah, maybe 30 years, and you're having these responses now. And it's why I share sometimes what happens to me because I'm a living example still of that experience. And hopefully, people hear this podcast and go, 53 years?
Mm.
Seriously? Yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
And I'm not ashamed of that.
Yeah.
And I think unless people, with long lived experiences, not just a year, 2 years, or they think that's a long lived experience, it's not. I've been in this 53 years. I wasn't expecting it. It happened. I'm okay with that. But it's probably always going to happen.
Mm.
There's still layers to perhaps attend to. Not like it was in the early years. Absolutely not. But it's getting comfortable with being human in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so aware I usually ask a question about misconceptions, and it feels like, gosh, that really is quite a powerful misconception about the idea of what grief looks like in reality. It's
Oh
yeah.
gosh, what does it look like in reality? Again, I've got all these little phrases that, I've developed over the years. It's not just a box of tissue and a few tears. It's
Yeah.
not just lighting a candle and remembering somebody. I mean, that still triggers me. That still triggers me every Christmas when someone says, let's just light a candle and remember them. Well, I can't remember them. Do you have,
Mm.
like,
Hmm.
sometimes, good intentions still activate our grief. And it's getting comfortable with what that means. It's like, it's really painful because I can't remember my mum.
Mm.
The memory's completely gone. I've got felt sense now through the work I've done, but memories, minimal,
Yeah.
very, very minimal.
Mm.
Um, so I think, is it's really, really listening to your inner process. The misconceptions is certainly for, adults who are bereaved as children. There will always be fragments of it, even, after those first initial years or even decades of trying to hold it at bay, and where it comes out in behaviors that don't even look like grief.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't look like it's not a box of tissues and tears. It's, relationship dysfunction or anxiety or depression or acting out or rage or, all sorts of different ways in which, behaviorally we're trying to function, and I'll put my hand up to all of those
Mm.
in a previous life. But then we need to understand that grief doesn't look like grief as well. It can look like grief. And of course, we have to be able to have that grief. But I mean, when I was probably less well known, people would arrive with a, dilemma. And then I would take, a clinical history. And there it was.
Bingo. Yeah.
And and individuals didn't know their current dilemma was probably deeply rooted in their early life loss.
Mm. Yeah. And I guess that's the one thing that often unites people, isn't it? Is like, I think from my experience, I love the fact that grief touches every walk of life. I think sometimes when you can bring together bereaved people in a space, it never fails to amaze me the commonality people find in their loss. And it's people that often would have had no interaction with each other whatsoever, very different social classes, just different intersects of society. But grief
Yeah.
experiences really do unite people when we can have the space to talk about them because they are so varied but also so interconnected as well. It's that real
They
paradigm.
are. I mean, what what's through my support website, we have developed in-person groups, and um, and I've talked with people over the years the types of, say, community supports they've um, been to, and of course there are crossovers in a way. Um, but some of what adults bereaved as children sit with. I mean, I do a session in my young persons group called Unspeakables. There are lots of unspeakables that you would not necessarily share with, say, a different type of grief. But I bring that in because we think things that are sometimes quite outrageous.
Mm.
And it's airing those as well that we think. I mean, sometimes over the years they have left my mouth when, I wasn't so informed, the envious feelings I felt, or,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the the anger at people that would say certain things. Um, and again, like, my pain, about someone lighting a candle, whereas for somebody else that might be okay. But for me, that's really painful and insensitive because I can't do that. It touches the very core of you that's really painful.
Yeah.
But I always talk about unspeakables in a closed group of people who've experienced early life loss because it's liberating,
Yeah.
and like they kind of go, "Oh, am I allowed to say this?" It's like, usually I start them off and then they go, "Oh, yeah, no, I think, oh, yeah, yeah, you said that. I think that too."
Mm.
These are the dark elements of grief
Mm-hmm.
that a lot of us don't talk about. They're there, but they need expression. That's part of the therapeutic process. And so that we can understand what they might mean and what they mean for that individual person, and what is it really touching.
Mm.
Often, it touches pain or fear or envy, something like that,
Yeah.
that we understand as clinicians what that means and how we can support that person in those really painful expressions that don't
Yeah.
look like grief. They look like someone being a bit of a pain, but
Mm.
they're not. They're
Mm.
grief.
Yeah. I found this when I worked at Child Bereavement UK. That was often something that would come in our referral forms. 9 times out of 10, I would say it was a behavioural issue that young people were being referred for, when actually, when we started to kind of go behind it, obviously it was massively connected to their loss
Yeah,
and their experience of it. But, the thing that put them onto somebody's radar essentially was that they'd been put out of school, or, they weren't attending school, or, they'd been causing problems in their social circle or at home. And
yeah,
yeah, I
yeah.
think that behaviour is often
Normal.
the thing that other people are like, whoa, what's going on here?
Yeah, because we don't like, I'm going to put inverted commas, bad behavior.
Yeah,
But
we
if
don't
you,
tolerate
if
it.
you, and I mean, I did a talk once at Child Bereavement UK for their staff, and I did a synopsis, pretend client with various things I had seen over the years. And like they were like, yeah, because it doesn't look like, it looks like someone who's out of control, or
Mm.
someone's, behavior is adrift, and well, what else is happening? If you dig deeper, it is grief often.
Yeah.
Um, but it doesn't look like it. It changes shape, it morphs into something else.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
of course, that part needs attention, and that's through, clinical work. It doesn't just, this is where different support, as we talked before, came on. Different presentations require different support, as is certainly named and discussed in sort of the European Grief Conference, where you have different levels of support for different types of presentations. And we have to understand where those limits lie, and when you don't want to over attend to things, and you just certainly don't want to under attend.
Yeah.
And certain sort of, we call it sort of traumatic grief, but and it's not just that the event is traumatic. I think there's also to have a differential in that the experience is traumatic. And some of the research I've been reading around is really discussing, we might think that, certain types of losses, are traumatic, and of course they are. But for children, that is true, but also the experience of losing a parent is traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
So it might not be how that person died, but the experience of actually losing a parent.
I'm just remembering I had a wee kind of light bulb in my brain there, Mandy, of research that was done as well around that idea of, what people anticipated as being a traumatic bereavement response versus what actually went on to be a
Yeah,
traumatic bereavement response. And I think the kind of general thinking would probably be that people who had time to prepare and say their goodbyes probably would be less likely to be traumatically impacted by it, but actually it was near enough 50-50 down the middle between
yeah, yeah,
sudden and unexpected deaths versus those who actually had anticipated the loss and had been with their loved one at the time of death. And that for me was really like validating because it's what I see, but also quite affirming in that sense of like,
yeah.
yeah, this isn't just a weird anomaly that, I sometimes crop up
No,
against.
it's not. And because also, everybody's an individual, and you've got different types of people with same experience, but they're different typologies. So you'll see differences in families,
Yeah.
between siblings, for example. So I think you really have to look at it as a very individual basis. And I've been curious about one of the things that is discussed, about how children should kind of be part of the funeral and the
Mm.
and the the ritual that happens in that. And occasionally I kind of, when we're talking about, whether someone, did go to the funeral. I didn't go to my mother's funeral. And for many years in my own lived experience, I thought, well, I think I should have. But I'm really sat on the fence now, as
Okay.
clients have taught me. Um, I've spoken with several that have been and wish they hadn't, because a
Mm.
lot of their traumatic memories are in that space. Because again, it wasn't navigated in a way that they could integrate that. So yeah, I mean, I think we should never be so sure about anything,
Mm.
because it's different for everybody. And I was like, oh yeah, no, people should go, thinking that I'm reading the research that is, and for that part that's been researched, that may be true.
Mm.
But in my experience, talking to people, it's 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 both ways. People that haven't been wish they had, and people that have been wish they hadn't.
So I was 2 years older than you were when my dad died unexpectedly, and I did go to the funeral. It was my first experience of a funeral, but my family had kind of, to the best of their abilities, prepared me for what was going to
Yeah,
happen. There was loads now doing this work that I look back on and I'm like, wow, that really was not it was not an adequate picture for an 11-year-old to go into, but I was there. I got through the day. But one thing I would say, just as you're kind of posing that question there of like, is there a right or a wrong in it, is that I think because his death was sudden and unexpected, I didn't see him when he had died, so there was no, didn't view the body or anything like that.
yeah,
His body was removed from the house by the time I came home from school to, like, was brought home from school, so he was just gone. And I think actually having the funeral gave me that opportunity to have something tangible to make sense of it. Whereas I kind of wonder,
yeah,
like, had I not have been given that opportunity to go to the funeral, or had I said I didn't want to go, it almost would have been like he'd just been plucked out of my life and was gone. So I think actually for me, in my experience of it, as much as it wasn't a nice experience to have to sit through, my dad's funeral, it gave me something quite tangible to
Andrew, yeah,
pin
no,
my
no,
grief on
no. I
almost.
mean, yeah, I mean, I think I always felt that because I was plucked out. I had no idea my mother was going to die. I was taken out of bed in the middle of the night, taken an hour away to an aunt's house. It was Easter time. I played with my cousins, and then 3 days later, a distant family relative, came to me and said, "Mummy's gone to heaven." That was it.
That was it, gosh. Yeah.
So I didn't have anything tangible. I couldn't make sense of it at all.
Yeah.
Understandable. I had, a few difficulties after that,
Mm,
and I I don't remember anything from that moment.
mm,
My mother, I didn't go to the funeral. But I think I was curious about the funeral.
mm-hmm.
Um, but hey, what happened happened. I have to navigate what happened.
Yeah. And as children, we don't have a say in that often. You know, it's like more and more now people are asking the question of the children or young people around about them. But certainly in my day, I don't ever remember anybody sitting me down and saying like, "Would you like to come or wouldn't you? Do you know what's your preference? What do you need just now?"
Yeah,
It was just
and
decided for me.
and how can someone so young even contemplate that decision? I mean, you don't have the developmental capacity to even rationally think that through. You
Mm,
have to rely on the people around you to make those decisions. I mean, maybe if you're a bit further down, you know, the journey, in terms of your age developmental capacity, you might be able to make more of a rational decision, sort of teenagers, later teenagers.
One of the things we often talk about when we're delivering training on this is the idea that like when a child or a young person is age enough to be asking questions about something, then they're old enough to have an answer to that
Yeah.
question. The task, I suppose, for us as the adults is to try and figure out like how do you put that into a context that they can really understand in a way that is tangible,
Yeah.
concrete for them, do you know? And I think sometimes that's where things kind of fall away a little bit. Yeah.
I think the answer is there is no answer.
Or no right answer, I suppose, yeah.
No, there is no right answer, and I think you have to do the best with whatever the family decide is best,
Mm,
knowing what they know, how they can manage, how they feel their child can manage.
yeah.
I think that's about as best as we get.
100%. I'm conscious we're rapidly running out of time, and I feel
Okay.
like there's so many avenues we could go down in this. But I want to pose my last question to you, Mandy, and I don't know whether you'll be able to pin something down or not because your experience is so vast. But has there been a moment or an experience that you've had along the way that's just really affirmed your commitment to the work that you're doing? Like, have you had one of those moments where you're just like, yes, this is the right place for me?
Um, I I think when I did my first research, and although it was grueling, I think that opened the door to kind of where I am now. And I feel completely aligned as to where I want to be in my life,
Beautiful.
need to be in my life.
Mm,
Um, and I think going through my own grieving process and doing it in a research capacity made me really understand what was possible beyond, experiencing early life loss. I think it's the thing that still makes me emotional
mm,
about what is possible, and that my life. I remember doing kind of my first UKCP reaccreditation, and someone who had, been at my place of training, and I remember saying to her, "I barely recognize myself."
wow.
The transformation was so enormous, from that research. And I think that's what inspires me every single day I work with people, that I'm in the right place,
Mm,
because it's it's something I didn't want to do. In fact, I pushed against it. It was like, I don't really want to research childhood bereavement. I was just so, that I don't want to go there, and I understand now a lot more why that was there. but that affirmed what was needed for my own personal life, but also what I could use that for in supporting others. And I'm hoping, the PhD, as I, keep putting my tractor wheels on the ground and keeping going, will bring more. I mean, I don't know what it will bring, because we never know what research will bring. But I don't think it will stop me talking about this passion of, what is possible beyond experiencing this, and that even if we have had early life loss, we all deserve to live.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for today's conversation, Mandy. I think it's been so eye-opening, and I think your breadth of experience between, that psychotherapy hat, the research hat, and the lived experience, it really does bring such an interesting perspective to this conversation. I'm so conscious that people listening are probably going to want to find where you are in the online space. So if people do want to connect with you, where would they find you?
Um, so I think if we're talking about, this work, then there's a resource website, which is abcgrief.co.uk. And then I am on social platforms as well. So my professional space is on LinkedIn under Mandy Gosling. And then I'm on Instagram at ABC Grief. And also there is a Facebook page, which is my name, and also it's Mandy. I think it's under Mandy Gosling Therapy. Anyway, if you go to the website, the links are all there. I can never remember exactly, I don't post masses because that's really not my space, but I hopefully post some things that are happening or behind the scene. And of course, there are other podcasts on my website, which, that's been really useful. And I appreciate you inviting me, Karen, because I've been doing them over the years, and they've evolved to, with my
Mm,
own knowledge as I walk on this journey, and they have been really, really helpful for people to understand that
yeah.
there is this experience, and even if it's many decades ago, that actually, what they're experiencing is valid. So I try and weave in some of the personal, but also to, help people realize what is beyond that and how you walk with it.
Mm. Thank you, as I say, for today's conversation. Just a reminder to our listeners as well that if it has been a useful episode for you, please do like, share, leave us a review, because as I said earlier, that's how we get the word out into the community, so that hopefully this episode will find its way to the people who need it most. If you do want to connect with me, I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, and both of those are at Continuum Counselling. And as I say, just make sure that you are subscribed, because that will give you a little notification whenever our next episode comes out. So, Mandy, thank you for our conversation today, and for our listeners, yeah, until next time.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.